Welcome to Democracy Differently, the podcast about why democracy isn't working and how to fix it. I'm your host, Keith Hyams, here with Simon Caney, Professor of Political Theory at the University of Warwick. Simon's a leading thinker on topics including climate justice, democratic theory, and global justice. Today, he's here to talk to us about democracy and future generations. More specifically, why democracy is currently ill-equipped to consider the interests of future generations and what we can do about it. Simon, thanks so much for coming.
Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation.
As always here on the show, the first question we have to ask you is, in a sentence, what do you see as the biggest single problem with democracy?
Yeah, I think the biggest problems are problems when there are decisions which impact on people and they have to live with the consequences, but they're not included in the process. So anything with a global dimension, anything that affects future generations, and anything that combines both is going to be extremely difficult to deal with.
Can you explain a little bit about the significance of future generations to democracy? What's the relevance?
I think the main relevance is that what we do now has a huge impact on the quality of lives they lead. We affect what kind of world they inherit, ecologically, economically, the level of conflict. And they have no say in this, so they inherit a world of our making. And normally we think the job of a government is to sort of protect the interests of its people, but here are people who are being ignored generally and marginalized from this process.
So when we're talking about future generations, are we talking about currently existing children or children who aren't yet born, people who aren't yet born, or both? Is there an important distinction between them?
Yeah, so I think we could define future generations to mean those who are not yet born, but I think it's important to include children, young adults in this sort of consideration as well, because they are politically largely powerless. I mean, they can engage in protests, but they lack the vote. They're often not consulted, not listened to. So let's include those within this remit.
So in your work, you talk about something called harmful short-termism, and you say there's 4 factors that contribute to harmful short-termism. Can you explain to us what harmful short-termism is and what these 4 factors that create it are?
Right, so let's begin with harmful short-termism. I mean, people often complain that politics is short-termist, but being short-termist is not always the wrong thing to do. If there's a huge problem today, like a terrorist attack, we expect the government to deal with it straight away. The harmful point is supposed to pick out cases where we think it's just wrong to privilege the short term in the way that is very commonly the case and to ignore the longer term. So to fully answer that, I'd have to say, what are the criteria of harmfulness? And maybe we can talk about that. But I think maybe I should just move on to the second part of your question unless you would brought me to more.
No, that's really helpful. So let's make it real. Let's kind of think the most concrete example at the moment, climate change. How does this harmful short-termism play out in practice in a case like climate change?
So, I mean, let's rewind to sometime like the 1990s when we were getting lots of reports from things like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change about the impacts of using fossil fuels and the way we're using land on the climate system. I think what we see there is it's a short-term policy in the sense of there was just delay, procrastination, and we see that still today. And then the long-term dimension of it is complicated because, of course, as we all know, it's affecting people right now. But when we emit carbon into the atmosphere, it is having implications for people living in 100 or 1,000 years' time. So there's that long-term effect there. But there's also kind of another long-term effect that's or 2 others that aren't often kind of fully appreciated, which is one, the way we design things like towns and cities will perhaps lock in people to carbon-intensive ways of doing things. And so when we're designing towns and cities and energy systems, we have to bear in mind that they are locking in energy, which might have these long-term effects. And just one other thing, I mean, some of the solutions also have major long-term effects. So nuclear energy is often touted as an appropriate response, but that has even greater timescales in terms of its impacts.
So you don't think that something like nuclear is going to be a solution to a long-term problem like climate change?
No, I mean, I think it perhaps could have been if there were no alternatives, but I think lots of measures, including massively upscaling renewables, is a much better way of dealing with that. They don't have the same long-term risks of harms.
Okay, great. So we've got climate change, a clear case of short-termism, short-term decisions leading to long-term consequences. Can you give us some other examples of where this short-termism is playing out and the long-term is suffering because of what we're doing in the short term?
Yeah, I think once you start thinking about it, you can see it everywhere. So let's just stay in the realm of environment. We see with biodiversity loss, people often talk about there being a sort of ecological debt. We have activities now, and they have a delayed effect on biodiversity loss. We see ocean acidification. We see actually almost all environmental problems, they have this nature. But I think, we see it in almost every area of policy making. So if you read analysts on things like macroeconomic policy, they'll frequently say, our governments are just engaging in crisis management, short-term tinkering. They're not thinking about big structural change for the long term. Or you see it in pensions, or you see it in education, or you see it in infrastructure design. Almost everyone says infrastructure is crucial, but it's the sort of thing that we cut from budgets. So at the risk of being the kind of person who sees what they're working at everywhere, I do think it is kind of everywhere.
Great. So let's dig a bit more into why these short-term things are happening. So let's go back to the four factors that we talked about earlier. Of these four, which do you see as the most important, the strongest influence of the short-termism?
Yeah, maybe I should say a little on the four factors, and then the way I think about it was influenced by an international relations scholar called Kenneth Waltz, who wanted to explain why war occurred. And he said there are three images, three kinds of explanations. One is human nature. One is what kind of state it is. Is it a democracy or an authoritarian state? And the third is just the very nature of the system. The international system is you've got loads of states and no overarching authority. Now, I think we could apply this to politics over time. So there are explanations which appeal to features of human psychology, whether they're cognitive ones that we're just not very good at noticing, detecting slow-moving problems, or that we suffer from wishful thinking, or that we downplay the probability of unfamiliar phenomena. And then there are motivational ones, which is, people get motivated by vivid experiences of people suffering, not what will happen to people in 50 or 100 years' time. So it's like image one. And then if you look within states, there are lots of features within states which incentivize a focus on the short term, whether it's obviously elections might do this, or audit timetables, or the performance indicators that governments use. So that's a second image. And a third image is that in a way we have anarchy over time. We have governments with a fixed duration of time, followed by another, followed by another. And Obama may have put in some climate legislation, but Trump could undo it. Then Biden puts in the Inflation Reduction Act, and then Trump can undo it. And the fact you've just got this sort of intergenerational collective action problem is really hard. And then the fourth one is we have people who live with the consequences of these decisions, but they are politically powerless because they are not born. So they can't vote, they can't protest, they can't make their voice heard, they can't throw the rascals out. And for me, it's this fourth category is the really hardest one, because there's nothing we can do about that. I do think features of human nature are somewhat plastic, so we can do all that. We can change the internal structure of states in ways. The third factor is a little bit harder because we can try and bind future generations, but that raises lots of ethical quandaries in itself. But the fourth one, that there is no easy solution, I think.
And one of the other things you say in your work is that it's not just about reforming political institutions. There's also these broader issues in society that contribute to harmful short-termism. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, one of them is just start with citizens. People often say, and political scientists have found, that when you have elections, governments are incentivized to focus on short-term benefits. And that's because, and to the extent that citizens are quite short-sighted in their orientations, But I think one thing we've learned from political sociology and from psychology is the extent to which we focus on the short term is malleable. And it's a function of lots of things, including whether there's a cost of living crisis, when Emmanuel Macron put on a carbon tax, and no kind of compensation or aid for the least well-off. Immediately people said, they revolted. We had the Gilets jaunes. And I think that's because the conditions for people for thinking about the long term were absent there, or political stability, or a really crucial one in lots of political science is trust in the government. So if it says we want you to have a sacrifice now, but it's for the long-term gain, people are not willing to put up with that. So I'd say one category really is the social determinants of people's attitudes to the future. And here's another category. I do think the type of political leadership we have is crucial. So I think Macron got that very catastrophically wrong. But it's really hard. You need political leaders who can juggle different time dimensions so that when there's something happening today, they can respond to that. But they don't kind of crowd out the medium term or the long term, and they're willing to negotiate these different ones. And I think lots of political leaders just aren't very good at that. And I'll just quickly mention two others. So one other is governments, especially treasuries, use these economic methodologies, and implicit in these, they use discount rates, or actually explicitly they use discount rates. And often these don't give sufficient weight to the interests of future generations. And so the analyses they come up with are kind of geared towards the present. And then just a very final one, I do think the language of politics makes a very big difference. Aristotle points this out in the Rhetoric. He sort of says that people get motivated by a vivid experience of a phenomena. And when you get these dry statistical kind of presentations of data about climate change or biodiversity loss, it doesn't, I think, resonate with people. So there's a lesson there about the communication of the impacts of the long term. And it's important to use language which communicates what it's actually going to be like for people.
So these external factors, are they as important as the institutional political factors? How do they interact?
I do think, it's quite hard to measure and say, they are identically significant, but I do think they are really fundamentally important. So if we just look at recent political history, if you don't have the electorate on your side, and you can maybe disregard them for a short period of time, but it's not going to last. And so I think what I find is lots of proposals are very reactive. They think everyday citizens are quite short-sighted, and let's try and bypass that. And I think that's like democratically suspect and illegitimate in my view. But instrumentally, I just think it itself is short-sighted. So I do think the social determinants are like really, really significant. And then if you have political leaders who just can't juggle these different timescales, you really need an agent of change, someone who's willing to do these things. And if all they do is perpetually focus about the next election, then this, progress is going to be severely hampered. So yeah, very important.
Yeah. So let's move on to something else. So some people listening might be worried that if we change democratic institutions so that they somehow built in the interests of future generations more, that might mean that the interests of the present generation don't get represented sufficiently, that we somehow do too much for the future, not enough for the present, or that it's somehow democratically illegitimate because decision-making in the present will be taken away. What do you say to this concern?
I think that's a reasonable concern about some conceptions of long-termism, those that want to maximize, let's say, total utility, and that's quite compatible with imposing enormous sacrifices on the current generation. But that's not what I'm defending. I would have an account of intergenerational justice that's concerned with passing on democracy, passing on the protection of rights to civil and political liberties, and achieving a high standard of living for current generations, to the extent that we can also bequeath a similar level to future generations. So I don't think there's a necessary trade-off. I do think some people may be worse off, but that's because there are some people who are fantastically wealthy who are responsible for the largest proportion of harm for the environment. So those in the top 1%, are likely, under any fair, just distribution or just transition, going to pay something, but the vast majority of people, I think, will benefit from this.
Here's another thing people might say, that we don't need to worry too much about the future, because technology is progressing at such a rapid rate. That's going to sort out all of the problems. We'll be able to solve climate change. We'll have AI that can do incredible things. If anything, the future will be better than us. So why are we worrying about the future now?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I think we have to think about what technology can do and what its limits are. So if you think about the environment and ecology, I think there are just very clear limits on our capacity to adapt. And so it's just not acceptable to say, oh, we'll go for a 2 degree or 3 degree, 3.5 degree world, because the technological developments won't be sufficient to protect us. And I think that's to do with substitutability. It's not that we can have a higher temperature but more sophisticated technology that will somehow enable us to cope. And the ecological economists who look at this just think that's a fantasy. And then I think there are other sort of second type of limits to technology, which is, many of the things people care about are really to do with social relations. They don't want to be persecuted. They don't want to be humiliated. They don't want to be ostracized. They don't want xenophobia, bigotry. They want a political system where their voice is heard. And I think technology is not a panacea for that. In fact, sometimes it can harm that. And then, so there are these different types of limits to what technology can do. And then the third thing is, my understanding of the history of technology is sort of fairly Schumpeterian. It's a process of creative destruction. It's never an untrammeled good. And that puts a paramount significance on political structures to make sure that harmful forms of technology don't develop, and that where we get technological advancements, they're sort of fairly distributed. So just saying, let technology flourish, and I'm sure it'll look after itself, is really, I think, naive. Then we have to think about it being located within a fair sort of social political relations.
So we need political solutions to guide technology and how it's used.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Mostly.
What about on the international front? Obviously, a lot of the long-term problems we face, climate change, development of AI, they're international.
Yeah.
What's the point in a particular country reforming its democracy to be more long-term when we have so many other countries that need to contribute? How do we solve the international problem?
I mean, I think that's really hard, and it will vary for some of those problems. So, I mean, one question to ask is, although global coordination is needed, how much is the problem just to be dealt with at the global level? So let's take COP negotiations for climate. The parties there are going, and they are representing what their governments back home are telling them. So if you've got short-sighted governments back home, then you're going to get short-sighted agreements made at the COP. So I think dealing with things at the state level is fundamentally significant and necessary. But then there are ways that we can much improve the COP negotiations. And this is partly, I think, disempowering certain bodies that play a disproportionate role there. So, states and corporations are seeking only to preserve their interest in fossil fuels. They're harming that process of taking the long view. And then there's ways of empowering organizations and members of civil society who are willing to take and want to take a long-term view. So I think there are lots of ways we could change international structures to make them more future-oriented.
So it talks about the problem of harmful short-termism in politics. And your suggestion is that we could think about ways to innovate in democracy to address this problem. Could you give us some examples of the kind of democratic innovation that might address harmful short-termism?
Yeah, so there are lots that I'd like to propose, but let me just focus on one or two to illustrate it. I think the key to thinking about it is, what are drivers of short-termism and how could they be responded to? So let's take a problem that's quite common in the UK at the moment. We have infrastructure and utilities like water that are performing disastrously. And the explanation is this has been outsourced to private actors with short time horizons. Seems to me an obvious response to that is to nationalize those. And I mean, unless you're kind of still delegate it to these actors and somehow ensure that they perform the long term, it seems that the best thing to do is to incorporate them back into the state. Otherwise, what you're doing is setting up a system where their remit is really to look for the long-term benefit, but their incentives are just to make profit, and that seems a disastrous way of looking at things. Take another kind of issue. I do think long-term issues just get squeezed out of the parliamentary calendar, and politicians rarely talk about it. So one way you can rectify that is by insisting that there are, future or visions of the future days, what I've called them, where at all levels, schools, universities, firms, but also in Parliament, the focus of the day, or maybe a couple of days, is to think about what are the impacts of our policies on the future, what future challenges are emerging that we're not addressing. And it's just to prevent the present from crowding out the future. It's a sort of democratic artifice to bring the future center stage. And then here's a third one, which is there isn't a body whose role it is to protect the future. So for a long time, I've tried to persuade people to have a parliamentary committee for the future whose job it is to scrutinize legislation for long-term effects. Because if it doesn't do that, no one else is going to do that. So those, I think, illustrate the kinds of things I have in mind, but also the reasoning is to think what's causing the problem, how can we respond to that?
Mm-hmm. What will be the sort of pathway that could lead to innovations coming into being?
Yeah, so I think it's useful to think about cases of countries where some progress has been made. So two examples I can think of are Finland, which created a committee for the future in the 1990s, and Wales as a Future Generations Commissioner created in 2015. And I think, one essential thing was in both cases there were agents of change. There were groups of politicians who were deeply committed to doing this. And I think without that, it's just not going to get anywhere. In Finland, it's kind of interesting that there was a Green and a Conservative MP, and they both agreed. So there was like a cross-party agreement that if you're Finland and Russia is your next door neighbor, then you really need to think about the long-term geopolitics a bit. So you need an agent to change, and preferably you need one which is not seen as partisan, sectarian, just representing a particular constituency. And then I think you need a political opportunity. You need circumstances to be propitious for people to be willing to get behind that. And I'm afraid at the moment, I think the circumstances are really unpropitious because there's a cost of living crisis. And so everyone is focusing very much on that. So I think in a way, there's not a window of opportunity just at the moment. That there was a bill put forward in the UK by John Bird, the founder of The Big Issue. And I think, kudos to him and his team for doing that. They are showing the leadership that's needed. But in 2022, when Parliament was prorogued, that just died. So I think hopefully that's somewhat the answer. You need an agent of change, you need a broad coalition, and you need a window of opportunity.
Well, so if there's people who are listening who are thinking, well, it all sounds great, and wouldn't it be nice if we had these long-term innovations, but you just said it's going to be hard to bring them into being. What would you say to those people who want them to come into being but aren't sure how to help that happen? What can individuals do?
Well, I mean, there are groups campaigning for this, and there are youth associations. And I think the solution to all of these things, in a way, is always organize. It's always join something, work together. And so within political parties, there is kind of cross-party interest in these ideas. I know people who are Greens, people who are in the Labour Party, Conservatives, who are all deeply committed to the long-term future of the country. And I think I would just encourage people to make connections, make links, and organize and try and put this on the agenda. And even ideas that seem like really remote can come to pass. If we think of Brexit, at one point in time, it seemed utterly remote that the UK would ever disengage from Europe. So I think people just have to think about campaigning, even if the prospects don't look promising, and see where that gets us.
What's the most interesting long-termist idea for democracy you've come across?
I think an interesting idea actually comes from literature. And in literature, we often find scenarios where, let's take A Christmas Carol, Scrooge looks into the future and sees his future self. When Gabriel Garcia Marquez, there are depictions where people now think about what their future self would think looking back, and you see us in Fernando Pessoa. So this is not a proposal, but I think it'd be interesting to see, could you replicate that in politics and get people to reflect on what their future self would think looking back to now.
So, Simon, thanks for all your answers. We always end these podcasts with a quick-fire round of questions. So, in one sentence, first question, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of democracy?
Pessimistic about the nature of the challenges we're facing and the magnitude of them, but optimistic in the goodwill and commitment of a number of groups and people.
Of all the democracies in the world, which do you see as being best equipped to face the challenges of the future?
I think ones that are inclusive, that have power sharing and proportional representation.
Will democracy ever be a thing of the past?
I don't think so.
Why not?
I think I read a very interesting book by David Stasavage on democratic ideas, and they originated way before the Greeks. And I think it's an idea that will occur to people always, that when someone's got power, why can't we be part of it? Why can't we collectively decide? So there may be huge obstacles to it in the future, but I think the idea it is one that human beings are reaching in social environments.
If you could ask one question to someone living in the year 3000, what would it be?
Do you know how we can create a more equal world, one characterized by freedom, democracy, and sustainability, and respect for all said in life?
Do you think future people will look back on us fondly?
No, I don't think so. I will think that they will look at us and think you had these amazing opportunities and capacities and you squandered them.
What do you think could be the most effective but maybe unexpected way to get democratic nations to adopt a more long-termist perspective?
So I do think proportional representation and power sharing, there's lots of showing that it's much better at governing for the long term. And I think to many people that seems counterintuitive.
And lastly, if you weren't a political philosopher, what other career would you choose?
I think I would have had a series of careers. I like teaching, so I'd have been a teacher, but I like working on archaeological sites. I'd like to engage in conservation. I'd like to work as a teacher abroad and travel the world. So no single one career.
Thank you, Simon. At the beginning of the episode, we asked you what you consider to be the biggest problem with democracy. And given all we've talked about, can you summarise in one sentence, if you had to pick one thing for democracy to do differently, what would it be?
I think my truthful, awkward answer would be there is no one thing that we can do that will solve the problem. If you really want to push me, say, by one sentence, I would say what we need is to have a political system that opens up for public debate and contestation at all levels, including youth, schools, universities, firms, all levels of government, to kind of crowd share ideas for dealing better with the future. And we need to reserve time in all the political organs so that this is an agenda item that they must sort of publicly debate and deliberate.
Simon, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks very much.
I hope you've enjoyed the podcast. Please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. I've been your host, Keith. Thanks for tuning in.